Okay, so there we go. We should be recording. Hope everybody can see everything and hear everything. You know, I sent those emails out yesterday that gave everybody your current grade. So obviously I got a lot of questions about that, which makes sense. So I want to clarify some stuff. I sent you your total grade, like, hey, here's the exact number of points you have at the moment. And then I said, hypothetically, basically the information I gave you was if you just did nothing else for the rest of the semester, right? You didn't take the final exam. If you haven't done quiz 8, you don't do quiz 8. If you haven't done the lab, you haven't done that. Right? I'm saying if you do absolutely nothing else, that's the grade you would have at the end of the semester, right? I'm giving you a current snapshot. Now, if you go to look at your grade at Moodle, it might say something different. So let's take this person, for example. If they had, let's say they have 720 points. Hypothetically, if they were to like end the semester now and not do any other additional assignments, right? The entire course is worth 1,000 points. So you can see here, hopefully, maybe I can zoom out a little bit more. Yeah, there we go. Someone who has 720, right? Divide that by the total possible points of 1,000. That would mean they have a 72% C, right? That's the email that they got saying, hey, you have a 720 points. If you were to do nothing else for the rest of the semester, you would end up with a C. But if they were to look to see what their actual grade is right now, when you look at Moodle, your Moodle takes into account how many possible points, how do I put it? Not for the entire semester, but like all the assignments you've done, how many points have you earned? So this person that we're talking about right here hasn't done the final yet. So right, 1,000 points is the total points for the course. But if you take away the points that the final is worth, which is 140 points, then you're left with 860, right? So this person has 720 points out of a possible 860 points. So when you do that math, this person has an 83 B. That makes sense? So the upstairs, this one is, again, the hypothetical, like here's how many points you have. This is what your grade would be if you did nothing else. And if that doesn't look the same, if this part right here, the letter grade doesn't look the same as what you're seeing in Moodle, this is why, because Moodle takes into account what you've already done. Another great example, if you were to look at your grade at the first week of class, and you scored perfectly on the assignment we had, which was the lab, right? You got 20 points out of your lab, right? Imagine 20 divided by 1,000, right? That's going to be very low, right? So at the beginning of the semester, you would have had like a 0.2 or 2% would be your grade, right? Which is very low. However, at the beginning of the semester, the only thing that you had to do was that one lab. So at that point, you could have only made 20 points. So you would do 20 divided by 20, and obviously that would give you a 100% A. Does that make sense? So again, the top arrows are showing you what your grade is divided by the total for the entire course. The bottom shows you what your grade is if you were to look at it in Moodle. Because Moodle only takes into account the work that you've done. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, if you have questions about your grade, please don't email me because it can be confusing. Just meet me online so we can talk about it. It'll be a lot quicker. We'll make sure you understand it and all that. So again, if you have questions about your grades, let me know. It's 8 o'clock. Whoops, let's get started. I'm not even gonna do attendance, so we'll just do what we usually do, which is you send the words in. I guess the only difference is for you guys, just make sure you send the words since I'm not taking attendance. Only because I've got to finish a chapter. So here we go. Let's jump back into it. I should have had this set up earlier. Sorry, guys. Anyway, while I'm getting this moved up and set up, let me get rid of this. I will say, like you may have seen in one of my announcements, I think it was only on Facebook though. Yeah, there we go. Today, I'm going to finish this last chapter. So if I have to go over 8:50 to do it, I will. Obviously, you guys are only supposed to be here till 8:50. So when 8:50 leaves, you can log off the computer, you can leave this room, do whatever you want, but I'm going to stay and I'm going to keep recording this lecture. That way you guys have that material when you're ready to watch it. So we are recording. Screen is shared. Let's jump into it. Actually, let me find out where we left off. Then we'll jump into it. We should have been right about the halfway point. The first word for attendance will be preparation. As in to highlight my lack of preparation because I didn't have this pulled up already. All right, there we go. And again, just like last time, and because we're in such a hurry, I'm not going to take questions because I'm trying to get through this quickly. So if you have questions, jot them down on a piece of paper and then ask me afterwards. Come visit me for office hours, physically or online. So this is where we left off. We were talking about interspecific competition, which is this bullet point right here. And that's the last example I gave you with these two paramecium. So when they're in separate cultures, like think about little petri dishes, when they're not competing with each other, they have a similar growth rate. But then once you put them together, one outcompetes the other, right? That is a great example of what happens when you have two competing species in the same area. So that's interspecific competition. The next thing we're going to talk about is mutualism. This is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You've probably heard of it before. Mutualism is when both species benefit from a relationship, right? So unlike the last one, when those two species were competing with each other, and yes, one of them may have come out on top, but it was still hurting both of the species, right? In this case, this is the opposite. Both of them benefit. Sometimes this occurs between symbiotic species, and symbiotic species are species where there's a close physical association between the two. You might need to know that. So if you're taking notes, you might want to do that again. That might be an important bullet point for the exam. So an example of that, not that I'm going to ask you an example, but an example of mutualism between two symbiotic species is this root fungus association known as mycorrhizing. You definitely don't need to know that. Again, this is just an example. But there's a fungus that lives on the roots of certain plants. For example, beans, the peanuts, things like that are very known for this. But anyway, these fungus are not free living. They only live on the roots of these plants. And both the fungus and the plants benefit. The fungus delivers mineral nutrients to the plants. So things that the plants couldn't get on its own, the fungi is delivering it to them. So that's how the plant is helping. Meanwhile, the fungus is receiving organic nutrients from the plant. So the stuff that the fungus needs that it can't make itself, it gets from the plant. So again, they're both benefiting. So that's just one example. Actually, I'm going to give you another example. Again, it's just an example, so I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. Corals. Corals depend on algae that live inside the cells, right? So these coral polyps, which are an animal, most people don't think of that, but corals are animals. But inside their cells, they actually have living algae. So again, they both benefit. So the sugar that the algae produces is used by the coral to do respiration, right, to provide energy. Meanwhile, the algae gains shelter because it's a safe place to live. It's literally inside the cell of the algae. And also, it has access to the coral's waste product. For example, this CO2, like I just said, coral is an animal, so it goes through, well, that's a bad way to say that, but coral goes through respiration, so it is producing carbon dioxide, and algae needs carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Another thing that all animals produce, we produce urine, but all animals produce some form of it, and it all has this in common. It has ammonia, and ammonia is nitrogenous, and algae needs nitrogen, so they receive basically fertilizer from the plants. But again, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about it. Here's another example. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch a little video that shows the clownfish and the sea anemone. So there you go. I'm giving you 3 examples. So really quickly for independent work, again, you could one of the things you can do is always question what I say, what my PowerPoint say, what the textbook says. So you could for example, give me the textbook definition of mutualism, and then find another source and say, according to this source, this is the definition of mutualism, and then just write a few sentences where you can compare and contrast. Like how are the 2 definitions the same? How are they different? Which one do you think is better? So on and so forth. And then again, another independent work topic is I've just given you these 3 examples: root fungus association, corals, and sea anemone and clownfish. You can give me some more examples for mutualism if you want. Which brings us to the next one, which is predation. You guys should be familiar with this. Again, I'm not taking questions, so if you have questions, write them down. We'll talk about them after the lecture. Predation is when one species kills another species. It's that simple, right? And that is called predation. We call the species doing the killing the predator. We call the species getting killed the prey. Once again, that's the book definition. Once again, for independent work, you can look it up from a different source, compare and contrast. So that's it, right? That's pretty simple. Most of what we're going to talk about for predation is talking about the adaptations that different animals have evolved, either to be a better predator or to be a better prey, right? To be, to get away from the predator. So that's what we're about to talk about in the following slides. But that's a great example, right? We've all seen these nature shows. There's a lion killing or trying to kill a zebra so it can eat it. That is an example of predation. And of course, before I move forward, obviously predation is a plus minus situation, right? So the first one we talked about was interspecific competition, which was minus minus, where both species are harmed. The last one we talked about was mutualism, which was a plus plus, where or both species benefit. And predation, obviously, one species is going to be harmed, and then it's beneficial for the other species. So here's some examples, and I'm probably not going to ask you about these, so I'm not going to put an X, but I will put a big question mark. Some examples of some things that have been some adaptations: speed, right? So antelopes are very fast, so they can outrun the predator. We could go into this for a long time. This is really good examples of almost like an arms race. So the prey will eventually, obviously, evolve to be faster, but then again, so will the predator, right? Because only the fastest of the predators are going to be the ones that survive. So therefore, they're going to be the ones that pass along their genes, whatever it is that made them fast. So over time, the predator and the prey, they keep getting faster and faster. Same thing with rabbits, right? The faster, they'll evolve to be quick, but so will the predators. These are just two examples of animals that have evolved speed for independent work. You can give me some more examples. And again, you can just send me one email that says, here's another example, according to this source, blah, 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 right? 1 point for that. Or if you want to, you can write a paper about it. Anyway, that's one example. Our speed is one thing that they've evolved. Another thing they've evolved is mechanical structures. So for example, porcupine quills, right? They're pokey. That's why they're there, right? They're there for defense. They've evolved that to keep themselves from being eaten. Clams, they have hard shells, right? That protects them from being eaten. Those are just two examples. Once again, think about some other examples of mechanical structures, other examples of things that animals have evolved to keep themselves from being eaten. Then there's another thing that animals have evolved, and it's called camouflage, aka cryptic coloration. Obviously, this is very simple. It just makes them hard to see. Right? That what's probably hard to see there. That's a seahorse in coral, right? It's hard to see. That's camouflage, aka cryptic coloration. So here's some more examples of cryptic coloration. There's a frog on the bottom left, on a rock. There's a spider on the top right that's in sand, and again the seahorse on the bottom right. So anyway, those are just examples, and those are the three examples I've given you for camouflage. Is this particular frog, this particular spider, and this particular seahorse. So again, a world of opportunities for independent work questions right there if you want to look into it. Give me some other examples of animals that are basically camouflaged. And in this particular case, we have these two. They're camouflaged because they're the predators. So they're camouflaged so they can find and kill their meal. This one, if I remember correctly, the seahorses are camouflaged because they're trying not to eat. So again, this camouflage, it's not just always the predator or the prey, or not just camouflage, but any of the ones we talk about, speed or mechanical structures. It's both, right? Both types evolve camouflage, whether it's the predator or the prey. And again, sorry, I'm not taking questions. We just need to get through this. So write down your questions if you have them. If you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little animation that shows those seahorses in action. So what's the opposite of camouflage? In a sense, we have this, warning coloration. This is certainly not camouflage, right? These animals stick out like a sore thumb. But that's okay. The reason they're doing it is because this lets their prey know that they have chemical defenses, right? So this meaning they're either poisonous or at least very bad tasting, or at least they'll make you sick, right? So for one way or another, these things, they're brightly colored for that reason. It's to warn the predators. So eventually the predators learn, they associate these color patterns with undesirable consequences. Let me put it next to this. If I do ask you any questions about warning coloration, I'm not going to ask specifically, like, what are the color patterns? The point is, in a sense, warning colorations are kind of like the opposite of camouflage. They're not trying to be hidden. They're just trying to say, hey, look, here I am, but trust me, you don't want to eat me. So, yep. And again, what do we have? A poison dart frog there, a monarch butterfly. And to be honest, that's a particular type of sea slug. I don't remember what that is. Obviously, that's some sort of caterpillar. I don't remember what kind it is. So for independent work, what is this thing? What is that thing? What are some other examples that are not up here that are not in your textbook that are for warning coloration. All right, and then there's like I'm gonna say an offshoot, but a different version of warning coloration, right? Sometimes a prey may gain protection via something called mimicry. So this is still sort of like warning coloration, except in this case, they're faking the funk, right? In this case, they have these bright warning colors to say, hey, watch out, I'm poisonous, or I'm venomous, or whatever. But sometimes it's just fake. And this is a classic textbook example is the difference between coral snakes and king snakes. Hold on, let me make sure we're still recording and make sure we're still going. Bear with me, sorry. It's a very important lecture, obviously, since it's the last one. Yep, still recording, still going. All right, sorry about that. Anywho, yeah, so I wish Morrison was here because actually growing up, I don't know if it was the same for him, but growing up in South Florida, I was very familiar with these because they're common down there. And there used to be a saying, red on black, friend of Jack, red on yellow, kill a fellow, to help you know the difference between the two. Anyway, again, that's just one example of mimicry. Again, you can look up some other examples of mimicry other than the this relationship between the king snake and the coral snake. So again, the coral snake is the deadly one. Not that I'm going to ask you that, it's just an example. Coral snake is the deadly one. King snake looks a lot like it. Therefore, other animals try to leave the king snake alone too, because they don't really know any better. And they think they are poisonous. Excuse me, venomous. Venomous is when they bite you and it kills you. Poisonous is when you bite it and it kills you. Anyway, moving forward. Some other things that animals have evolved is kind of like a mixture of what we talked about before. For example, some insects combine this idea of protective coloration with some adaptations of disguises. And I'll give you some examples of that. Some insects, as you know, and I'm not going to ask you about this on the exam, they resemble twigs, leaves, and bird droppings. So again, independent work topic, find me an example of an insect that resembles a twig or a leaf or a bird dropping. Send that in, write a paper about it, or just send an email for 1 point. Some of them actually imitate vertebrates. And I'll give you a picture on the next slide that shows one. But there's a caterpillar that on one side, it tries to hide, right? It's got coloration that lets it blend in. But then sometimes the coloration doesn't work, they can't blend in, and they're about to get eaten. So they flip over and they're no longer trying to hide, and now they're just trying to fake their predator into thinking they're not a caterpillar, but they're a snake instead. So there you go. There's the caterpillar on the left and an actual snake on the right. So you can see how a predator might get that confused. Obviously, they're different colors, maybe not the same type of snake, but you can definitely see how that thing looks like a snake, right? Anyway, again, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. If you find any other examples for independent work, that would be great. Remember, independent work is due tonight at midnight. And I can always guarantee you I won't be accepting late work for that. Only because I'm just not going to have time. Because most people haven't done the independent work yet, so I'm going to have a lot to grade. Anyway, the next thing we're going to talk about is herbivory. You're very familiar with this already. This should be very simple. Let's go through it very quickly. Herbivory is the consumption of plant parts or algae by an animal. So whenever an animal eats basically something photosynthetic, that's herbivory. And speaking of which, I guess the next word for attendance will be vegan, right? Because vegans are basically herbivores. So herbivory is usually not fatal for the plant, right? Unlike usually when unlike the last thing we talked about, when a predator kills a prey, an animal kills another animal, that's usually deadly for the animal, right? But in this case, it's not usually deadly, but it can be bad, different varying degrees of bad. But just like we talked about and focused on in the last bullet point when we're talking about predator-prey relationships, we're also going to focus on this, how things have evolved. So plants have evolved defenses against herbivory. They include things like spine, thorns, trichomes, which are like little fuzzy hairs on plants is what trichomes are, and also chemical toxins. I'll show you some examples on the next slide. These are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any of these, so put a big old X through here. The point is evolution happens. Things have evolved ways not to get eaten, including plants. So we'll take a look at this list, and then of course, if you see anything that's not on this list, for as an example of things that have evolved, plants that have evolved a defense, then you can send that in for independent work. But obviously rose bushes, right? We're all familiar with rose bushes. They have thorns, they prick, they hurt. That's what it's there for, right? Plants that eat leaves aren't going to want to go into that thorn bush and try eating because they're going to get, poked. Same thing with a cactus, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with cactuses. Most of them are cacti, most of them are spiky. That's one of the reasons why. The poison is produced by a tropical vine. This is from the old textbook. I don't even remember which tropical vine they're talking about. So once again, you can look that up for the bit of work. What are some tropical vines that produce poison? Morphine from the poppy seeds, right? From the opium poppy, which is very interesting to me. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit, not just this one, but everything below this line. The irony here, I don't know if you want to call it irony, but slightly interesting thing here is these plants have evolved ways to keep things from eating them. And then humans came around and were like, ooh, I like that, right? So the morphine that you get from poppies, that's also where you get heroin, right? So people do that. That's drugs. That feels good to them, so they do it. Same thing with nicotine, right? Nicotine's a drug. It's meant to be a pesticide. And humans are like, ooh, I like the way that makes me feel. Spicy food, right? Cinnamon, cloves, peppermint, all these things that humans enjoy. That was actually a way of a plant, something the plant have evolved to keep things from eating them. And really quickly, not that you need to know this, but I did mention, I don't know if it's up here, but yeah, it's not up here. Capsaicin, right? So when you eat something that's spicy, that's supposed to deter mammals from eating it. But it's not to deter everything from eating it, because the idea there is birds can eat hot peppers, and they don't have the sensors, so it's not spicy to them. Therefore, when a bird eats the pepper and they fly around and poop, they are spreading the seeds better than a mammal would. So that's how they've evolved that. Anyway, here's some pictures of what we're talking about. There's peppermint at the top left, cloves at the top right, cinnamon here at the bottom, right? So all these strong flavors that humans use, especially this time of year, right? Because it's close to Christmas or any other holiday you might celebrate. And we have all these strong flavors in our food. And there you go. Those strong flavors are there to keep things from eating them, ironically enough. Again, not taking questions. So if you have questions, write them down. We're going to go to the next section, which is all about parasites and pathogens. This is also pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Parasites are something that live in or on a host from which they obtain nutrients. And that's what parasitism is. All right, so this is another plus minus, right? This helps the parasite, this hurts the host. But it's not quite like predation, because in this case, the parasite doesn't usually kill. Well, sometimes it can. But the goal, if you will, is not to kill the host. The parasite wants to live from the host, right? It wants the host to be alive so it can obtain the nutrients. So death is not really a good thing. When the host dies, it's not good for the parasite either. But nonetheless, it's still bad for the host. Some examples: tapeworms, roundworms, tick, lice, mosquitoes. If you can find some other examples of parasites, good independent work topic. And two, not just the parasite, but its host, right? So you can mention that. And there's all kinds of really interesting stories out there about parasites. I think I mentioned this before, and I'll say it really quickly again. I think it's pinworms. Is it hookworms? There's some kind of worms where the way it's spread is they've got all the eggs are on the ground. This is back in the day. The eggs are on the ground for feces. So then when it rains, it activates the eggs, not the eggs, but the little baby worms, and they start like reaching up towards the sky. And then when something walks on them barefooted, like a human, it gets into their skin and literally crawls all the way up through their flesh into their lungs, right? And then that causes a cough. And then people will cough like that and then swallow, as you naturally do. But when they cough, let me back up a step. When they get into your lungs, they lay eggs. And then the eggs are sitting there doing their thing in your lungs. And then when you cough like that and then swallow, then the eggs go from your lungs to your mouth into your stomach. And then they hatch in your stomach. And then when you poop, you're pooping out the worms, and then the cycle continues. I think that's hookworms or pinworms. I don't remember which, but it's pretty gross. But anyway, the interesting thing about it is people who used to, I guess still do, they dip tobacco or snuff or whatever, they actually had less of this problem, because when they coughed, if they were affected in their lungs, when they coughed, they didn't usually just swallow it again because they had tobacco in their mouth, so they would spit it. So they actually were less affected by these parasites because unbeknownst to them, when they were spitting their tobacco, they were also spitting out these parasites. Anyway, that's just an example of parasites. Pathogens, these are basically diseases, disease-causing things, small things that cause diseases, like bacteria, viruses, fungi, protists, prions, which we learned about earlier. So pretty simple stuff. If you have any questions, write it down. We can talk about it after class. The last part, under interspecific interactions, is commensalism. This is like instead of a positive positive or a negative negative or a positive negative, this is more like a positive neutral. This is when one species benefits from the relationship and the other one doesn't hurt or help. An example of this is the seahorse I showed you earlier under the context of camouflage, right? So that same seahorse, its benefits because it's looking like the coral, right? So it has that look. It finds the coral, it can hide there and keep itself from being eaten. The coral, on the other hand, doesn't matter to them, right? They get no help or harm when the seahorses do that. That's just one example of commensalism. Again, for independent work, you can look up more examples. And again, this is the textbook definition of commensalism. Again, you can look up a different version and compare and contrast. Here's how the textbook defines it. Here's how my source defines it. Here's how these things are similar. Here's how they're different. Here's everything we just talked about wrapped up in one little table. This is not from your current textbook. So if you like this table for studying, you should download the PowerPoint. But it's cool. It just shows, again, like interspecific competition, bad for both species. Mutualism, good for both species. Predation, good for one species, bad for the other. Herbivory, good for one species, bad for the other. Parasites, pathogens, good for one species, bad for the other. The only thing not on that table is the last one we just talked about, which was commensalism. And again, that's good for one species, neutral for the other. Again, I'm not taking questions. So if you have any questions about this, write them down. We'll talk about it later. And now we'll go on to the next major bullet point, which is trophic structure. I'm going to go through this very quickly because as far as the exam is concerned, there's like 1 or 2 questions, and I'll tell you about it when we get there. So forgive me for going through this quickly. The trophic structure is the feeding relationship among species in a community, right? So whether you're talking about a food web or a food chain, that's trophic structure, right? It's talking about how things interact as far as food is concerned, as far as energy is concerned. Because trophic structure determines the passage of energy and nutrients from plants to herbivores to predators. The reason I put a little star next to the plants is because in this situation, I'm describing a terrestrial ecosystem. Of course, it doesn't have to be terrestrial, it can be aquatic, in which case the nutrients and energy would go from algae to herbivores to predators. But, basically instead of plants, I guess what I should say is photosynthetic organisms, or maybe even if I was going to get even more specific, producers. But I'll tell you, I'll introduce you to that term here in a second. So, one way of looking at a trophic structure is something called a food chain. You're all very familiar with it. I'm sure you've been looking at these things your whole life. A food chain is the sequence of transfers between trophic levels. Here's an example, right? Here's 2 examples. You have an aquatic food chain on the right. You have a terrestrial food chain on the left. At the bottom, either one, whether it's aquatic or terrestrial, at the bottom you have what's called producers. And you do need to know that for the exam. The very bottom of a food chain, or even the other thing I'm about to teach you later, at the bottom are what we have producers. These are the things that produce their own food, right? Whether it be from photosynthesis or chemosynthesis or anything like that. They produce their own food. And then things that eat them, or anything above them actually, those are called consumers. You need to know that for the exam. Producers at the bottom, everything else above that are consumers. So we humans are consumers. A bear eats us, it is a consumer. We eat a plant, the plant is the producer. Again, write down questions if you have them. So herbivores are what we call primary consumers. So let me back up a step. Like I said, at the bottom here, we have producers, which is the things that produce their own food, right? And then I said everything above that is called consumers. That is true. Now let's get even more specific. We can separate those two. We can subcategorize consumers. We have primary consumers, which are the things that eat the producers, right? Those are the herbivores. We have the secondary consumers. Those are the things that eat the primary consumers. We have the tertiary consumers, which eats the secondary. And sometimes, depending on the ecosystem, we might have quaternary consumers, which eats the tertiary. So again, these are all examples. You can look up some examples if you want for secondary, primary, tertiary, quaternary, for independent work. That's how it works. So don't get it confused. Again, above the producers, you have primary consumer, which is the second step up in the food chain, right? So that's where people usually get it confused on the exam. So this is the first step. Those are the producers. This is the second step. But the second step, those are called primary consumers. So, and then the third step is secondary consumers. So don't get those numbers confused when you think about the total steps from the food chain. All right. So far we've only talked about from here up, right? We keep talking about producers and consumers. But also there's things down here, right? There's also stuff that eats dead stuff, right? Those are called, well, first of all, let me just read it from here. Some consumers derive their energy from what's called detritus, which is dead material, right? Dead material left by all the other stages. Primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, producers, they all leave dead stuff, right? And these things take advantage of that. They're consumed in different stages of decay. So if it's a dead animal, for example, something that's eating a dead animal would be considered a scavenger. It's like crows, vultures, etc. Etc. being a good independent work topic. What are some other scavengers? Then you have things called detritivores. These are the things that are eating decaying organic material. So they're like taking like dead leaves, for example, or poop. Right? They're eating it. Right? That would be a detritivore. Some examples include earthworms and millipedes, and once again, etc., which would be a good independent work topic. What are some other detritivores? Then below that, you got the stuff that's really taking care of the small stuff, which are the decomposers, right? So these things aren't eating because they're usually like unicellular. I don't want to say that. They're not always unicellular. Either way, they're not eating, right, necessarily. They don't have mouths, but they are secreting enzymes and they are digesting. This is like the last stage of breaking something down, right? Imagine, again, some dead animal. The scavenger is going to eat the dead animal and poop it out. So you're taking the big chunks of dead animal and turn it into poop. And then here you have the detritivores that can take that down and digest it even more. And then finally you have the decomposers that can take what's left from the detritivores and digest it all the way down into those molecules we learned about way at the beginning of the semester. The carbohydrates, the amino acids, the lipids, all those things, they're broken down so that other organisms can use them. Again, sorry I'm not taking questions. If you have them about this slide, now's a good time to write them down. The next slide I'm going to show you is a good example of this. This is a compost bin, and what you're looking with here is mostly detritivores, right? So the detritivores, like earthworms, will eat this material and break it down and poop it out. And then you'll have the fungi and the bacteria that will take that poop and break it down even more. All right, this brings us to something called biological magnification. There might be one question on the exam on this. It's very simple, so if this is stressing you out, don't let it stress you out. First of all, we have to point out that organisms cannot metabolize a lot of toxins. So usually when you eat, what that's saying is, usually when you eat something, your body breaks it down, right? That's just what digestion is. It breaks it down so we can get the raw material, plus we release the energy, right? Like you've learned from earlier in the semester. But not everything can be broken down, especially certain toxins. And because they are not broken down by the organisms, they become concentrated as they go up and up and up through the food chain, or the trophic levels, however you want to say it. And that is what biological magnification is. So here's a good example of this. This is a real example. There's this stuff called PCB. It's a bad forever chemical. It's really bad for us. Our bodies can't break it down. It's in the waters. It's in the waters in pretty low levels, right? So these zooplanktons, these things are filter feeders. So they're just taking food in from the water indiscriminately. So they're also accidentally bringing in some of these PCBs. So therefore, again, since they can't break it down, they have a little bit in them, right? They have about 1 nanogram for every gram, 1 nanogram of PCBs. But then you have the cod. So the cod's not just filter feeding. It's not just getting the small amount of PCBs that are in the water. It's eating these things, which have a higher concentration than the water did. Therefore, their concentration gets a little bit higher. And again, they can't break it down, so it just concentrates in their body. Then you have these salmon. These salmon aren't eating these little zooplanktons, and they're not filter feeding the water. So they're getting the higher concentration in this cod, right? That's a higher concentration right here. they're eating those, therefore they get higher concentration. And then finally, you have humans that eat the salmon, and then they can have really high concentrations, right? 350 nanograms of PCBs per gram of breast milk. And this is why, among other reasons, there's dietary restrictions for pregnant women. Right? This is why they say, hey, don't eat these big fish. This is mainly why, because of biomagnification. As you move up the food chain, these toxins become more and more concentrated. That's it for that topic. Again, if you have any questions, write those down so we can talk about them later. So far, all we've talked about, basically food chains, but let's be more realistic about things. Talk about food webs, right? Because very few communities are actually so simple that there's a one unbranched food chain, right? It's not usually like, all right, we've got this one plant in this ecosystem, and this one plant is eaten by this one herbivore, and this one herbivore is eaten by this one predator, right? It's not usually like that. Usually what we have is something called a food web. And I'm about to show you a food web on the next slide. You should be already familiar with it, I'm sure. But in this new concept, I'm going to also introduce you to a new term called omnivore, and I'm pretty sure you already know what that is too. So instead of talking about herbivores, which only eat plants, and instead of talking about carnivores, which only eat meat, we have omnivores, which eats both. It eats producers and consumers. Here's a good example. This is from the old textbook. This is much more realistic, right? It's kind of hard to see in the sliding, but it's not just one straight chain. Not like just this thing eats the cactus, and this thing eats that thing, and this thing, right? It's more complicated, right? It's a food web. All these things eat different things. Then you have the omnivores that'll eat plants and animals, right? So it's a very more complicated situation. I'm sure you're already familiar with it. I would say the most important thing I want to point out for this, not because of the exam, just for common sense, is earlier in this chapter we talked about the importance of biodiversity. This is a great example of that. So the more pieces of this puzzle you have, the more complicated it is. Therefore, you'd be a little bit better off if you do lose one species. If you just lose one species and you have a lot of species in that ecosystem, then losing the one species might not be that big of a deal because there's a lot of interaction there. However, if you had a small ecosystem, which is pretty much what we have here, losing one species would be a bigger deal because there's more things dependent on it, right? It's almost like a house of cards. Point is, again, it's just another good example of why biodiversity is so important, even though that's not the point your textbook was trying to make at that point. Anyway, write down any questions you might have about this slide because that's the last thing we're talking about with food webs. The next word for attendance will be owl. You can see it there at the top right. That is an owl. Speaking of species diversity and biodiversity, let's talk about this very quickly. Species diversity. We already talked about it before. We're talking about it again in a slightly different context. This is the variety of species in a community. So again, remember we talked about biodiversity on Wednesday. And there was different types of biodiversity. One of those types of biodiversity was called species diversity. So now we're just coming back to it to give you a little bit more information. So we're not talking about genetic diversity anymore or ecosystem diversity. We're talking about species diversity. Number of different species, which is what I was getting at with that last slide, right? The more species, the better. There's two ways of describing a species diversity. You need to know this for the exam. There's species richness and relative abundance. Species richness is the easy one. That's just the number of different species. So if you were to look at this room right now, there's more than we can see, but let's assume this is accurate. You would say the species richness of this room is 1, right? Because the only species in this room that we can see anyway are humans. Now imagine if somebody brought in 1 dog and 1 cat into this room. Then what would the species richness be? Actually, we don't have time. 3, because we'd have a dog, a cat, and humans, right? Species richness would be 3. However, relative abundance wouldn't be quite equal because we have a lot of humans. Well, I wish we had more. It's the last day of class. But anyway, we have more humans. And then, like I said, we bring in 1 dog and 1 cat. So as far as species richness, you would say we're biodiverse, but not relative abundance because we're almost entirely humans. Here's an example of this. Woodland A versus woodland B. It's, again, kind of hard to see with this lighting, but there's a lot of, not much diversity here in woodland A. You can see most of these trees are this hardwood oak looking thing, right? And then there's this one like pine, that there's like a Christmas type tree, and then this pine tree, right? But then here, woodland B, it still has the same species richness. There's still only 3 species here, but you can see the relative abundance in woodland B is better because it's not like, again, this one, woodland A, is predominantly 1 species. This one has a good equal representation of all. So again, for the exam, you need to know the difference between species richness and relative abundance. If you have questions, write them down, ask me later. Here's just a little graph showing the differences between those 2 woodlands we looked at earlier. Obviously, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. Next thing I'm going to talk to you about is also very important and relatively easy to understand. A keystone species is one that has an impact much larger than the total mass or abundance indicates. So I'll give you this example. I'm not even going to read it. I'll just show you the picture. Sea otters are a great example of a keystone species. There's not a lot of them, so you would think, if you look at this ecosystem, like, oh, sea otters must not be that important, because look, there's not a bunch of them. But here's how it works. Sea otters eat these sea urchins. Sea urchins eat the kelp. Kelp provide places, this is not even shown here, kelp provide places for fish to hide and lay their eggs, right? So what happens is when you remove the sea otters, then the sea urchins, nothing's eating them, so they overpopulate, therefore they eat all the kelp. Therefore, all the things that rely on the kelp also die, right? So the point here is you remove this one keystone species, which you wouldn't guess to be important because there's not a lot of them, but in this case, they happen to be important, right? You move this species and the whole ecosystem collapses. Here's another example. I think this is from your textbook. A starfish that happens to be a keystone species. You can see with the starfish, there's all, this is all this biodiversity. And then when you remove the starfish, there's less biodiversity. So that's a keystone species. If you have any questions, write it down. We'll talk about it later. Let's talk about disturbances and secessions in community. This is pretty simple as well, very simple concepts. I think the hardest part is just going to be remembering the exact words. Disturbances, we've already talked about it before, but here they are again. These are episodes that damage communities, biological communities, right? I don't mean like an episode that damaged the community of Amandaville or something. At least temporarily, destroying organisms and altering the availability of resources. So examples are storms, fires, floods, droughts, volcanoes, you name it, right? If it's something that's disturbing nature, at least temporarily, that is called a disturbance. So sometimes they can be very bad, as you might imagine, but sometimes these small-scale natural disturbances actually have positive impacts. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that, but this next slide I'm going to show you with these bullet points down there are a good example of how they can become a positive thing. And again, this is probably really hard for you to see. Might be easier to see here. But there was this tree that fell down in the woods. And, you've been in the woods. There's not much biodiversity in the woods, right? If you're in the because you got the big canopies, there's not a lot of light coming down, so you have the trees, but that's pretty much it. You don't have a lot of bushes, you don't have a lot of grass because there's no sunlight hitting the floor of the forest. But then let's say this thing falls down. Well, now all of a sudden, you do have sun hitting the floor of the forest. So now all these plants that need that aren't shade tolerant, now they can start coming back because there's sun. And what you can't see here, but you can kind of see there, when that thing fell over, it left a big crater, which is now filled in with water, and it's a little pond. So now not only do you have this terrestrial ecosystem that is now more biodiverse because of the sunshine, now you have this little pond. So you also have a little aquatic ecosystem. Again, the point here is that sometimes a disturbance can be a good thing for ecosystems. Humans are the most significant agent of ecological disturbance. That might be a test question. You might need to know what is the most significant agent of ecological disturbances, and those are humans. One consequences of this, there's something called the emergence of previously unknown diseases. I'm not going to ask any questions about that, so I won't really get into it. But they used to say, some people used to say that COVID might be an example of that, because there's a lot of things, for example, in China, they have these wet markets. So there's a lot of people getting in contact with a lot of these wild animals, and because of these disturbances, sometimes these diseases jump into the human population. Again, that's it for these emerging diseases. If you have any questions, write them down. We'll talk about it later. Ecological succession. So this is what happens after a disturbance. This is also very simple. Communities change drastically after a severe disturbance, right? So if you have one that strips away all the vegetation and soil, then things will start coming back. This is what ecological succession is. Before I move forward, I will say this. The only point here, when we're talking about ecological succession, if you have a big flood, for example, like we had in North Carolina, and it wipes everything out, but there's still some big connection that kind of wipe away the soil too. Anyway, life was wiped away in certain parts of North Carolina. And it's not like it's just going to come back willy-nilly, right? There's not just going to be all of a sudden an oak tree growing on a rock, right? What happens is we have this ecological succession. And ecological succession is basically life coming back, and it comes back in a certain order, just like political succession. When the president dies, it's the vice president that takes over. And when the vice president dies, I think it's the Speaker of the House, or I forgot which. Either way, the point is, it's a specific order, right? Same thing with the ecosystem. It's a specific order. What you do need to know for the example is the difference between a primary succession and secondary. So let's talk about that very quickly. Primary succession is when everything's stripped away. Like the example I was just giving you in North Carolina. If you've seen pictures of it, those floods not only just took away all the vegetation and all the plants and all the animals, but it brought it down to the bare bones, right? So there's nothing left, no soil, nothing. That's primary succession. Primary succession is when life comes back from basically starting completely over. Lava is a good example of that. Everything's covered in lava, you have nothing, you don't even have soil. Then you have secondary succession. So that's when you have a disturbance, but at least it left some soil. So you're not starting completely over. You're starting over, but not completely over because you do have some soil. That is secondary succession. That's what you'll need to know for the exam, is the difference between secondary and primary succession. And again, I just looked at the question yesterday. It's there. When a disturbance happens, life comes back in a specific order. It doesn't happen randomly. It comes back in a specific order. That's what you need to know for the exam. That is what ecological succession is. Ecosystem ecology. So we've already talked about population ecology. That was the last chapter. Now we're going to talk about ecosystem ecology. This is all pretty simple stuff. The hardest part, in my opinion, is just remembering all the different terms for all the different things. But the ideas should be very familiar to you. So you already know what a population is. You already know what a community is. Now let's talk about an ecosystem. I've talked about it before. I've already given you this definition, but here it is again. Ecosystems include a community of species. So, for example, all the living things on WVSU's campus. But also, now, because it's an ecosystem, now we're also taking into a factor all the abiotic factors, all the non-living things that affect living things. The energy, right? So the temperature, the wind, the soil characteristics, the water, the pH of the soil, all these things that are non-living but do affect the things that live there. The noise, right? If we're talking about WVSU's campus, the sound from the interstate probably does affect some of the living species that live on our campus. Probably some of them live more closer to the other side of campus because they don't like the sound of the interstate. A terrarium is a great example of an ecosystem because it's closed in. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it at terrarium. But I like it because it's good at illustrating these two concepts, which you do need to know. Energy flow. And this isn't just for a terrarium. This is for all ecosystems, but it's easier to picture it when you're thinking of a terrarium. Energy flow is the passage of energy through the components of an ecosystem. And that's exactly what energy does. And energy flows through an ecosystem. Generally, it starts from the sun, and then it goes to the producers and works its way up the trophic levels like we learned earlier. Then we have chemical cycling. Chemical cycling is the use and reuse of elements such as carbon and nitrogen. Those are just two examples. Anything that you can imagine that's chemical and not energy, that stuff usually gets recycled. Granted, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, most ecosystems are not a terrarium. Most of them aren't closed off like this, right? So yes, energy will always flow through. Even if it's closed off, energy will flow through an ecosystem. Generally speaking, we like to say that the chemicals are recycled in an ecosystem. But I do want to point out there is a caveat, not that it matters for the exam, just so you know. Usually ecosystems aren't in a little glass box, right? Usually they're connected. So we have the river ecosystem of Kanawha River, right? And we have the forest ecosystem that's next to it in some spots. Obviously, like when the trees lose their leaves and they fall into the water, that's a good example of how the chemicals in that forest ecosystem did leave the forest ecosystem. Then they went into the river ecosystem. So again, energy flows through, chemical or matter is recycled, but just so you know, it's not always recycled. Sometimes matter does go from one ecosystem to the other. So energy flow and chemical cycling involve the transfer of substances through the trophic levels Again, like we said, energy flows through, but ultimately out of ecosystems. And again, chemicals are recycled within and between ecosystems. So that is what you need to know for the exam. Those two things that I've already said, and now you can see them in writing. If you have any questions about it, write it down. We are going to move forward and talk about something called primary production. This also should be pretty simple. As you already know from day one of this class, all organisms require energy, right? That is one of those properties of life. If we take a closer look at it, we can see and look at how energy flows through an ecosystem. That might bring us bring some questions for us. So, for example, why are there so few top-level carnivores? So, if you watch one of those nature shows, where it's like thousands of gazelles and zebras, and there's like one pride of lion. So, why is that? We'll answer that question here in a second. How can we apply these energy flow concepts that I just taught you about to use our resources efficiently? So, humans, not just nature. Let's talk about this. First thing you need to understand is something called primary production. We're really running behind. We'll go through this really quickly. There's a lot of information here, but here's the point that you need to know for the exam. There's a lot of energy that hits the earth from the sun. A lot of energy. You don't need to know that, but there it is. There's a lot of energy. What you do need to know for the exam is from all that energy that's hitting earth, only about 1% of that is actually converted to chemicals via photosynthesis. So that process where they make the glucose and other carbohydrates, right? So that's the number you need to know, about 1%. Of all the energy that's hitting Earth, about 99% of it is lost, and only about 1% of it is used by those producers and brings it into the trophic levels, the ecosystems. Some other concepts you need to be aware of are something called biomass. I might ask you about that. I don't necessarily remember. The biomass is the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem. So right now, again, assuming that only humans are in this room, let's pretend like there's no mold or bacteria. If we wanted to know the biomass of this ecosystem in this room, we would just weigh all the humans. That would be the biomass. Primary production, you definitely need to know this for the exam. I'm pretty sure there's a question about this. This is the rate that producers convert solar energy to chemical energy stored in biomass. In a sense, it's almost, you could almost think of it as the rate of photosynthesis, right? It's how much energy is being converted, right, via these photosynthetic organisms. What you don't need to know is how much it yields, which is about 165 billion tons per year. So again, biomass is the amount of living stuff. Primary production is essentially how much living stuff is being produced every year by these primary producers. Different ecosystems are different. I'm not going to ask you that, but as you might imagine, some of them are more productive than others. Open oceans are not nearly as productive as coral reefs, right? Deserts are not nearly as productive as rainforests. You don't need to know this, but there it is for you. I put a big old X. I'm not going to ask you anything about what's more productive, what's least productive. Point is, some ecosystems are more productive than others. Usually the more productive ones have a lot of energy and have a lot of water. Oops. All right, let's talk about ecological pyramids. It's 8:50. You can leave if you want, or you can log off if you want. I'm going to keep going. I need to finish this. So if you do leave or log off, then later when I post the video, you can watch it. Anyway, energy flows as organic matter through trophic levels. So energy starts off at the bottom and moves its way up. And obviously, as we know from previous examples, that energy is stored in those chemical bonds. So as things eat, and that's how it gets pushed up the trophic levels, so does that energy. Energy goes with it too. What you definitely need to know for the exam is this right here. I'm going to give you a specific example in a second. But most of this energy is lost. Right? Every time you go up, you're going to lose a lot of energy. That's why this pyramid, that's why it's shaped like a pyramid. That represents how much energy. There's a lot of energy in this plant. Fewer in the herbivores, fewer in the predators, so on and so forth. Because, and again, I'm going to give you a number for this later that you're going to need to know. Most of the energy is lost as you go from one to the other. I'm not even going to give you this example. Let me just skip this. It'd be easier to just explain the picture that explains it. So, this caterpillar is going to eat plants. Let's say it eats 100 calories worth of plants. Of those 100 calories worth of plants that it just ate, it's going to lose 50 of it from pooping. It's going to use that energy for its own life, for cellular respiration. So it's going to lose 35 calories for that. And then only 15 calories of the stuff it ate is actually going to be used and incorporated into its body to grow. So the point here again is that this is how we lose energy when we go from one trophic level to the next. Which brings us to the energy pyramid, which is the thing we saw earlier. It's just, again, it just visualizes how much energy at each trophic level. And once again, here's some numbers you need to know. I already told you this one. Of all the energy, the sun energy that hits the Earth, only about 1% of it is actually used in primary production. And then, and I told you I was going to give you a number. Here it is, the number you need to know for the exam. As we go from one trophic level to the next, only 10% of the energy makes it, about 10%. Right? So the numbers actually vary, but generally these are the numbers you need to know. Of all the energy that hits the Earth, only about 1% of it even makes it into the ecosystems. And then once it makes it in there, only 10% of that makes it to the next level. And that's another great example of that. Pretty simple concept. And again, the only numbers you need to know is that 1% and that 10%. And I'm not even going to ask you to do math with those numbers. You just need to know those numbers. And because of all this, the energy that's available to the top level consumers is very small compared to the energy available to the lower level consumers. This is why most food chains are limited to 3 to 5 levels, because the higher you get, the less energy there is for those top level predators. All right, this brings us to ecosystem energetics and human resource use. So basically we're saying, all right, all these things that we just learned about nature, how can we use that for human use? You know what? I'm actually going to slide through that because there's not going to be any questions about that. It's basically just teaching the same stuff I just taught you. It's just looking at it from a human perspective and how, for example, vegetarians generally are better for the environment because they do better at obtaining that energy. No questions about that on the exam, so I'm skipping through it. This I'm also going to go through quickly because I know what's on the exam. So let me just teach you to the exam. I hate to do it, but let's do it. We're talking about, again, chemical cycling in ecosystems. So again, energy flows through ecosystems. Chemicals cycle through ecosystems. We're done talking about the energy, so let's talk about the chemical. Let's do it very quickly. We'll even pass through the general scheme. Here we go. There's 3 types of biogeochemical cycles that you're going to be tested about on the exam. The carbon cycle, phosphorus cycle, nitrogen cycle. Let's talk about them very quickly. It's actually quite simple as far as the exam is concerned. So here's what you need to know for the carbon cycle. The major abiotic reservoir, so the non-living reservoir of the carbon, is the atmosphere, right? And of course, there's also stuff like fossil fuel and things like that. But most of the non-living reservoir for the carbon cycle is the atmosphere. That's where you find most of the carbon in the world. It's not in living things, right? But it comes into living things, right? That's what photosynthesis is. Photosynthesis takes that non-living carbon dioxide out of the air and it makes biological molecules with it. At that point, the carbon is no longer in the abiotic reservoir. It's now in the biotic reservoir. It's in the living things of plants. And then people and humans and animals eat the plants and it's still in the biotic reservoir. It doesn't leave the biotic reservoir until something goes through cellular respiration, which takes that biological molecule, that carbon, that glucose, and breaks it down. And then, as you know, the carbon dioxide is released and it goes back to the atmosphere. So again, for the exam, what you need to know about the carbon cycle is the major abiotic reservoir for carbon is the atmosphere. You know that, the atmosphere. And if I ask you, I don't think you will, the way that the carbon gets in and out of the, goes between the biotic and abiotic reservoir is photosynthesis and cellular respiration. That's the process that moves it from the living to the non-living. The next one, and there's just a picture that shows a more complicated version. So here we go. The next one is the phosphorus cycle. And again, there's a lot more information, but I'm only going to tell you what you need to know for the exam. So the major abiotic reservoir for phosphorus is rocks. That's all you need to know. So again, carbon, the major abiotic reservoir is the atmosphere. Phosphorus, it's rocks. For carbon, the way it moves through the biotic versus abiotic reservoirs, photosynthesis and respiration. For phosphorus, it happens through weathering, right? Because the rocks are weathered, then the phosphorus goes from the non-living, the abiotic reservoir, to the living reservoir. And you can read about all this if you want. I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. Again, the point here is the major abiotic reservoir for phosphorus is rocks, which brings us to nitrogen. The major abiotic reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. Yes, it's soil too, but as far as the exam is concerned, it's the atmosphere. That's what you need to know for the exam. What is the process that takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and brings it into the biotic reservoir? It's not like carbon, which is photosynthesis. This process is called nitrogen fixation. So it takes the nitrogen gas that's in the air and converts it to a form that living forms can use. So again, atmosphere is the major abiotic reservoir. Nitrogen fixation is the thing that takes it from the non-living and brings it to the living. Bacteria do that. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. One more thing that I'll might ask you about is this right here. So again, the atmosphere is the major abiotic reservoir. Nitrogen fixation is what takes it out of the abiotic and brings it to the biotic. And the opposite, denitrification, brings it from the abiotic, or excuse me, the biotic, and puts it back into the abiotic. But for sure, the most important thing you need to know for the exam, and probably the only question about nitrogen fixation, is that the major abiotic reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. Nutrient pollution. I'm not even going to ask you any questions about this, but I will bring it up. It's at least worth talking about. Point here is plants need phosphorus and nitrogen to thrive, right? It's good for plants. However, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. That's all this is saying. Nitrogen and phosphorus, because they're so good at plant fertilizing, they can also be bad for the ecosystem. Long story short, what happens is all these nutrients, all these fertilizers, for example, and this happens everywhere around the world, but for example, they come into the Gulf of Mexico. Those are fertilizers, so photosynthetic organisms love them. So all these algae in this area, they love it. So they have this big algae bloom. It's like, oh, this algae, that sounds good. It kind of is, right? Photosynthetic organisms are good. But then those things die. And when they die, they get decomposed by bacteria. These bacteria use oxygen, and therefore they deplete all the water, most of the oxygen in those waters, and things just die. Those are called dead zones. But I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. I just wanted to go through it very quickly. Last bullet point. I'm going to knock this out, maybe even before 9. Thank you guys for staying. The next word for attendance, and this will be extra credit because everyone else, you guys don't have to be here, is extra. So the next word for attendance is extra. All right, so a lot of environmental problems are caused by humans, as you might example. So Ecological Research Foundation, or ecological research is the foundation for finding solutions to these problems and also avoiding the problems to begin with. I'm going to go through these things very quickly because as far as the exam is concerned, not life, but as far as the exam is concerned, is very unimportant concepts. Conservation biology is a goal-oriented science seeking to understand and counter the loss of biodiversity. Meanwhile, restoration ecology uses ecological principles like the ones that I've taught you to develop methods of returning degraded areas to their natural state, right? So conservation biology is like, hey, let's not screw stuff up. Restoration ecology is like, hey, we've screwed stuff up, let's fix it. If anything, that's what you'll need to know for the exam, but I probably won't even ask you that. You might need to know this term. It's very simple, biodiversity hotspot. And basically, the biodiversity hotspot is this. It's an area, a relatively small area, that has a large number of endangered or threatened species, or a high concentration of endemic species. And you need to know what an endemic species is for the exam, probably. And that is a species that's found only in that one spot. So again, biological hotspot is it's an important spot for biodiversity because it either has a lot of organisms that are threatened or endangered, and or it has organisms you can only find in that spot. That's what a biological hotspot is. This map is going to show you the hottest of the hotspots. I'm not going to ask you about that. You don't need to know where they are, but you do need to know what a biological hotspot is. So this brings us to conservation at the ecosystem level. Once again, very important or very unimportant as far as the exam is concerned. So I'm going to go through it very quickly. You already know what a community is, right? So that's just a bunch of things living together, interacting, all these different species interacting. Then the next step up from that, like we just finished talking about, is an ecosystem. So now we're not just talking about the living things interacting with each other, but we're also talking about how those non-living things affect the living things. And then we have to step up from that, a landscape. So a landscape, basically, as far as the exam is concerned, it's just a bunch of ecosystems. So now it's how these ecosystems are interacting with each other. And now that we know what a landscape is, let's talk about landscape ecology. And again, this probably won't be on the exam. Landscape ecology is the application of ecological principles to the study of land use patterns. So basically, it's taking everything we used, everything we've learned, and using it to do planning, right? How to plan a community. Then there's these things called edges. There's really not going to be any questions about that. The point is, you've got natural edges or edges created by human activity. And again, this won't be on the exam, which is why I'm glossing over it so quickly. Here you have a river ecosystem, right? Inside that river is a river ecosystem. Then you've got like this, I don't know, grassland ecosystem surrounding it. But at the border, right there, at the banks of those rivers, there's going to be a new ecosystem that's kind of like a mixture of the river ecosystem and that grassland ecosystem that's surrounding it. That's the point. Edges are also extra ecosystems, if you will. Again, as far as the exam is concerned, that is unimportant. So is this. There's something called movement corridors, and I'll just show you a picture. Some of them are artificial, like this. They built bridges, so this is in Canada, so the wildlife can cross over the highway without getting hurt. Here's a picture. So if you're a bird, you might just think, oh, birds just fly. They go where they want. Well, as you learned previously, some birds are a little bit picky. So if you're a bird who only likes to fly through brush for safety reasons, you couldn't get from a forest that you can't see here to that forest. But now we have these movement corridors, so these birds can fly through those little wooded areas and get where they need to go. Pretty simple, and again, not going to be on the exam, so I'm going through it quickly. Really quickly, again, not important for the exam, let's talk about restoring ecosystems. That is something called bioremediation. I might ask you what that is, but probably not. And it is exactly what it sounds like. Bioremediation is like fixing an ecological problem by using living organisms, right? There's some examples there. I'm certainly not going to ask you any examples, but again, bioremediation is using living things to take care of pollution. And there's a picture of somebody working on that. Then the textbook gives some examples of some restoration projects that have worked. You can read about them if you want. There's not going to be any questions about it. I'll just show you the picture and briefly explain it. So this used to be a canal. Humans built a canal from one lake to another here in Florida. And that was actually bad for the ecosystem. They finally figured that out. So what do? They filled in the canal, and now we can see the river is back to where it used to be, meandering river. And I don't have time to get into it, but there's a difference between a canal and a river as far as the depth of the water, the speed of the water, the water quality. Therefore, there's a difference between the things that live in them. So restoring things back to the way they were is usually a good thing. Which brings us to this last bullet point, the goal of sustainable development. No questions on the exam here, I don't think, so let's go through this quickly. As the world population grows and becomes more affluent or richer, as you might say, the demand increases for ecosystem services and for just stuff in general, such as food, water, wood, things like that. So the goal of sustainable development is to meet the needs of today without limiting the ability of future generations, right? So sustainable development basically just means this. We need to survive. We would also like to thrive, right? So we need stuff that the ecosystem is giving us, that the environment is giving us. But we need to do so in such a way that we don't use all the supplies, right? We don't want to leave nothing to the future populations. That's basically it. Yeah, we did it. So good job. And then one more last one is the extra. Extra is the last word for attendance because, again, those are not required. So you guys are just getting extra points. And that's it. I have to really go quickly and go down to my office for office hours because even though I'm with you guys, I also have other courses and those students might need me. So I'm going to go down.